October 7th, 1944, 28,000 feet above Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Second Lieutenant William Dunham pulled his Republic P-47D Thunderbolt into a shallow dive, scanning the azure waters below for the Japanese task force that intelligence had reported. His aircraft, serial number 42-85743, carried the standard armament that would soon redefine aerial combat in the Pacific theater. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 425 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. 3,400 rounds total, enough firepower to disintegrate an entire enemy formation. Dunham had no idea he was about to prove that capability against overwhelming odds. Emerging from a towering cumulus cloud at 26,000 feet, he spotted them. 40 Mitsubishi A-6M-0 fighters, climbing steadily toward the American bomber formations operating above, the largest concentration of enemy fighters he had ever encountered in a single engagement. Standard tactical doctrine called for immediate withdrawal when facing such numerical disadvantage. Radio for assistance. Maintain altitude advantage. Avoid engagement until reinforcements arrived. Dunham ignored doctrine. He pushed the Thunderbolt into a diving attack that would demonstrate why American industrial firepower was reshaping aerial warfare across the Pacific. The morning had begun routinely enough aboard the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid, steaming with Task Force 38 approximately 100 miles east of the Philippine coastline. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The pre-dawn briefing had outlined a standard fighter sweep mission supporting the Allied invasion of Leyte. Dunham's squadron, VF-18, would provide top cover for dive bombers targeting Japanese naval forces operating in the Gulf. Intelligence reported moderate enemy fighter activity, perhaps 20 to 30 aircraft. Nothing unusual for experienced Thunderbolt pilots who had been flying combat missions since the Marshall Islands campaign. The Pacific Theater in October 1944 presented a dramatically different operational environment than the European air war that had dominated American strategic planning. Where European combat occurred over relatively short distances with abundant friendly airfields, Pacific operations required extended overwater flights to targets hundreds of miles from carrier decks. Aircraft had to function as long-range interceptors, escort fighters, and ground attack platforms simultaneously. The P-47D had proven remarkably adaptable to these diverse requirements. Its robust construction and powerful radial engine provided reliability essential for overwater operations, where mechanical failure meant certain death. The turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 delivered 2,400 horsepower at optimal altitude, enabling the Thunderbolt to climb rapidly and maintain energy advantages crucial for Pacific combat tactics. But it was the armament configuration that truly distinguished American fighters from their Japanese opponents. The 850 caliber machine guns represented a concentration of firepower unprecedented in single-engine aircraft design. Each weapon fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute when all guns operated simultaneously. The psychological and physical impact of such concentrated firepower proved devastating against opponents accustomed to lighter armament configurations. Japanese Zero fighters typically mounted 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannon. While the cannon packed significant punch per round, their slow rate of fire required precise marksmanship for effective engagement. The machine guns, though rapid-firing, lacked the penetrating power necessary against heavily armored American aircraft. Japanese pilots had learned to target cockpits and fuel systems, rather than attempting to destroy enemy aircraft through general structural damage. The disparity reflected fundamental differences in design philosophy and industrial capability. Japanese aircraft emphasized maneuverability and range at the expense of armor protection and heavy armament. This approach had proven devastatingly effective during the war's early phases when Japanese pilots possessed superior training and experience. But by October 1944, the tactical situation had reversed dramatically. American pilot training programs had matured to produce aviators with adequate skills and superior tactical doctrine. More importantly, American industrial capacity had reached production levels that enabled replacement of losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them. The numerical advantage that had characterized Japanese aviation during 1941 and 1942 had evaporated, replaced by American superiority in both quantity and quality. Dunham understood these strategic realities as he spotted the Japanese formation climbing toward the bomber streams. At 26,000 feet, his Thunderbolt possessed every advantage except numbers: altitude superiority, speed advantage, energy management capability, firepower concentration that could overwhelm multiple opponents simultaneously. The question was whether tactical execution could overcome 4-to-1 odds through systematic exploitation of technological superiority. The Japanese formation appeared well organized, climbing in standard 3 aircraft sections with appropriate spacing for mutual support. These were experienced pilots, flying proven aircraft according to tactical doctrine, developed through 3 years of Pacific combat. They were not the inexperienced replacements that increasingly characterized Japanese aviation units in late 1944. Their climb profile and formation discipline indicated professional competence that would make the engagement genuinely dangerous. Japanese intelligence had studied captured P-47 aircraft and understood their capabilities. Pilots had been briefed on American firepower advantages and tactical preferences. They knew to avoid head-on passes where Thunderbolt armament proved most effective. Standard Japanese doctrine emphasized forcing American fighters into turning engagements where zero maneuverability could overcome firepower disadvantages. These 40 aircraft were climbing to execute precisely such tactics. What Japanese pilots could not adequately prepare for was the psychological impact of facing concentrated 50 caliber fire during actual combat. Training descriptions and technical briefings could not replicate the experience of watching aircraft disintegrate under sustained machine gun attack. The visual and auditory effects of 3,400 rounds delivered at maximum rate created sensory overload that disrupted tactical thinking and eroded unit cohesion. Dunham's dive angle brought him toward the Japanese formation at approximately 450 miles per hour, building speed rapidly, as the Thunderbolt's weight and aerodynamic efficiency converted altitude into kinetic energy. At this velocity, the American aircraft became essentially a guided projectile, delivering 8 machine guns with devastating accuracy. The engagement window would last perhaps 10 seconds, enough time for systematic destruction if targets were selected properly. The lead Japanese section spotted the diving Thunderbolt at approximately 8,000 feet separation. Standard evasive procedures called for hard turns to force overshooting attacks while maintaining formation integrity for coordinated counterattacks. These pilots attempted exactly such maneuvers, breaking left and right, in practice defensive patterns that had proven effective against previous American attacks. The maneuvers proved inadequate against systematic firepower application. Dunham's first burst caught the lead zero at 600 yards range, delivering approximately 200 rounds in a 3-second firing pass. Armor-piercing incendiary projectiles penetrated the fighter's unprotected fuel tanks and ignited vapors that had accumulated during the extended climb. The aircraft exploded instantly, debris scattering across a 1,000-foot radius. The psychological shock of witnessing instantaneous aircraft destruction disrupted the formation's defensive coordination. Pilots who had trained to execute coordinated evasive maneuvers found themselves reacting individually to threats they had never experienced at such intensity. The systematic application of overwhelming firepower against aircraft designed for different combat parameters created tactical situations that existing doctrine could not address effectively. Dunham continued his diving attack, selecting targets based on positioning rather than attempting complex maneuvering that would surrender his energy advantage. The Thunderbolt's speed carried him through the Japanese formation faster than defensive reactions could coordinate, but his 8 machine guns remained effective throughout the transit. Each burst destroyed or critically damaged enemy aircraft that lacked adequate protection against 50 caliber projectiles. The engagement's opening phase lasted approximately 40 seconds and resulted in 12 Japanese aircraft destroyed or disabled. The remaining 28 Zeros attempted to coordinate pursuit of the diving Thunderbolt, but their climb rate could not match the American aircraft's diving acceleration. Dunham had achieved the tactical goal of disrupting enemy formation while inflicting maximum casualties through superior firepower application. What happened next would demonstrate why American industrial philosophy had fundamentally altered aerial combat dynamics across the Pacific theater. Rather than continuing his dive to safety, Dunham executed a climbing turn that brought him back toward the scattered Japanese formation. The Thunderbolt's powerful engine and robust construction enabled sustained combat maneuvering that lighter Japanese aircraft could not match without sacrificing their own energy reserves. The Japanese pilots found themselves facing a tactical dilemma that their training had not adequately addressed. Pursuing the climbing Thunderbolt meant operating in altitude bands where their aircraft performed poorly, while the American fighter maintained optimal capability. Remaining at medium altitude allowed the P-47 to dictate engagement terms through diving attacks that exploited overwhelming firepower advantages. Individual Japanese pilots attempted aggressive attacks against the lone American fighter, but coordination proved impossible when facing an opponent who could climb faster, dive deeper, and deliver devastating firepower during brief engagement windows. The traditional Japanese advantage in turning radius became irrelevant when the enemy refused to engage in sustained turning fights, instead using energy management to control engagement duration and geometry. The systematic destruction continued through multiple attack sequences. Dunham would climb above the Japanese formation, select isolated targets, dive through defensive fire while delivering concentrated machine gun bursts, then climb again beyond pursuit range. Each cycle resulted in additional Japanese aircraft destroyed while the Thunderbolt remained essentially undamaged. The tactic exploited every technological advantage American design had incorporated while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. Japanese pilots trained in close-quarters combat found themselves unable to bring their aircraft's superior agility to bear against an opponent who fought according to different tactical principles. The engagement had become less aerial combat than systematic destruction, with American industrial firepower overwhelming Japanese tactical skill through sheer destructive capability applied systematically. The few Zero pilots who achieved favorable positioning for attacks discovered that their 7.7mm machine guns could not penetrate the Thunderbolt's armor protection effectively. Rounds that would have proven lethal against unarmored Japanese aircraft merely sparked off American armor plating without causing significant damage. The disparity in defensive capability meant that successful Japanese attacks required precise targeting of vulnerable areas, while the American aircraft could destroy opponents through general structural damage. By the engagement's conclusion, 37 of the original 40 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond combat capability. 3 Zeros managed to escape by diving toward cloud cover at low altitude, abandoning their mission rather than continuing hopeless combat against overwhelming firepower. Dunham's Thunderbolt had expended approximately 2,800 rounds of ammunition, suffered minor structural damage from defensive fire, and single-handedly eliminated an enemy formation that should have required an entire American squadron to engage effectively. The tactical implications of this engagement would ripple through Japanese aviation planning for the remainder of the war, forcing recognition that traditional fighter tactics had become obsolete against American industrial firepower deployed systematically. The wreckage scattered across 20 square miles of Philippine waters told a story that Japanese naval aviation could no longer ignore. Flight Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Nishizawa, the most experienced Zero pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy with 87 confirmed victories, circled the debris field in his damaged A6M5 Model 52. Oil streaked his canopy from a ruptured engine line. His starboard wing showed fabric tears from 50 caliber rounds that had missed vital structures by inches. He was one of 3 survivors from what had been the largest fighter formation the Japanese could assemble for combat operations. Nishizawa had witnessed the systematic destruction of his squadron with the clinical detachment that kept ace pilots alive through impossible odds. What he observed challenged fundamental assumptions about aerial combat that had guided Japanese tactical development since the war's beginning. A single American fighter had eliminated 37 Japanese aircraft through firepower application that exceeded anything in Imperial Navy experience. The engagement had lasted 18 minutes, the longest 18 minutes in the history of Japanese naval aviation. The tactical after-action report that Nishizawa would file upon returning to base would become required reading throughout the combined fleet's remaining air units. His clinical description of American firepower effects and tactical methodology provided Japanese commanders with intelligence they desperately needed, but could not effectively counter with available resources. The report confirmed what many experienced pilots already suspected. Japanese aviation had lost technological superiority and lacked industrial capacity to regain it. Japanese aircraft production in October 1944 reflected resource constraints and strategic pressures that made effective response to American capabilities increasingly difficult. The Zero's design philosophy, which had proven devastatingly effective during 1941 and 1942, emphasized range and maneuverability over armor, protection, and heavy armament. This approach had enabled Japanese forces to project power across vast Pacific distances while maintaining air superiority against opponents who possessed inferior tactical doctrine and limited operational experience. By late 1944, those advantages had evaporated. American pilot training programs had matured to produce aviators with adequate skills and superior tactical doctrine. More importantly, American industrial capacity had reached production levels that enabled replacement of losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them. The numerical superiority that had characterized American operations since Midway had been supplemented by technological advantages that rendered Japanese tactical doctrine obsolete. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 remained fundamentally the same aircraft that had achieved air superiority over Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines during the war's opening campaigns. Weight increases from additional equipment had degraded performance slightly, but the basic design retained its emphasis on long range and exceptional maneuverability. What had changed was the operational environment in which these characteristics provided tactical advantage. American fighters had evolved to exploit weaknesses that Japanese designers had accepted as necessary compromises. The lack of armor protection that enabled the Zero's lightweight and exceptional range made it vulnerable to the concentrated firepower that American aircraft carried as standard equipment. The emphasis on maneuverability over speed meant that Japanese fighters could not dictate engagement terms against opponents who possessed superior energy management capabilities. The P-47D that had decimated Nishizawa's formation represented American design philosophy that prioritized pilot protection and overwhelming firepower over traditional fighter characteristics. The aircraft's weight, which exceeded twice that of a Zero, included extensive armor plating that protected vital systems and pilot compartments from defensive fire. The 850 caliber machine guns provided firepower concentration that could destroy enemy aircraft through general structural damage rather than requiring precise targeting of vulnerable components. This philosophical difference reflected broader strategic realities that shaped aircraft development in both nations. Japan's island geography and limited industrial base required aircraft designs that maximized operational range while minimizing production complexity. Raw material shortages and manufacturing constraints forced Japanese engineers to optimize designs for minimum weight and maximum efficiency, rather than adding protective systems that consumed resources without directly contributing to offensive capability. American aircraft development occurred within an entirely different strategic context. Continental geography provided secure industrial bases beyond enemy reach, while abundant raw materials enabled designs that prioritized effectiveness over efficiency. The luxury of secure supply lines meant that American engineers could add protective systems, redundant equipment, and heavy armament configurations that would have been impossible given Japanese resource constraints. The engagement above Leyte Gulf had demonstrated these philosophical differences through systematic firepower application against opponents, designed according to entirely different priorities. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability to overcome numerical or technological disadvantages. American doctrine increasingly relied on systematic application of technological superiority to achieve tactical objectives with minimum pilot risk. Lieutenant Dunham's attack methodology reflected training that emphasized energy management and firepower concentration over traditional dogfighting techniques. American pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's climbing ability and diving speed to control engagement geometry, while using overwhelming armament to achieve quick kills that minimized exposure to enemy fire. These tactics proved devastatingly effective against opponents trained to fight, according to different tactical principles. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots extended beyond individual combat trauma to encompass broader recognition that their tactical superiority had been permanently compromised. Experienced aviators like Nishizawa, who had achieved ace status through superior skill and aircraft capability, found themselves unable to compete effectively against opponents whose technological advantages overcame traditional Japanese strengths through systematic application. Japanese intelligence had studied captured American aircraft and understood their technical capabilities. What proved impossible to prepare for was the psychological effect of facing such concentrated firepower during actual combat. The visual and auditory impact of watching aircraft disintegrate under sustained .50 caliber fire created sensory overload that disrupted tactical thinking and eroded unit cohesion among even experienced pilots. The strategic implications of this technological disparity became apparent as Japanese commanders struggled to develop countermeasures with available resources. Traditional tactics that had proven effective against earlier American fighters proved suicidal against aircraft that could deliver overwhelming firepower while remaining largely invulnerable to Japanese defensive capabilities. New tactical doctrine required resources and training time that Japan's deteriorating strategic position could no longer provide. Flight training programs attempting to prepare pilots for engagement with P-47 formations faced insurmountable obstacles, as fuel shortages limited practice flights essential for developing new combat techniques. Japanese aviators found themselves learning advanced tactical concepts through theoretical instruction rather than practical experience, creating dangerous knowledge gaps that became apparent during actual combat encounters. The industrial disparity between American and Japanese aircraft production became starkly apparent through comparative analysis of manufacturing capabilities in late 1944. American factories were producing approximately 2,000 aircraft monthly, while maintaining quality standards that emphasized durability and combat effectiveness. Japanese production had peaked at approximately 800 aircraft monthly, but quality control had deteriorated as experienced workers were conscripted for military service. More significantly, American aircraft incorporated technological innovations that Japanese industry could not replicate effectively. The turbo-supercharged engines that enabled P-47 high-altitude performance required manufacturing precision and metallurgical expertise that Japanese factories had never developed adequately. The sophisticated fire control systems that coordinated 8-gun armament demanded electrical engineering capabilities that exceeded Japanese technical resources. The maintenance requirements of captured American equipment provided additional insights into industrial disparities that affected long-term operational capability. P-47 components demonstrated reliability standards that enabled extended combat operations with minimal maintenance intervention. Japanese aircraft required more frequent servicing and parts replacement, consuming logistics resources that were increasingly scarce as American submarine warfare disrupted supply lines. Component standardization represented another American advantage that Japanese industry had never achieved systematically. P-47 parts were interchangeable between aircraft regardless of manufacturing location or production date, enabling efficient maintenance operations and logistics planning. Japanese aircraft incorporated variations and modifications that complicated parts supply and maintenance procedures, reducing operational readiness rates among frontline units. The tactical modifications that Japanese commanders attempted to implement in response to American firepower superiority required resources and organizational flexibility that the deteriorating war situation could no longer support. New doctrine, calling for coordinated attacks and energy management, required extensive pilot retraining, increased fuel allocation for practice flights, and aircraft modifications that Japanese industry could no longer provide efficiently. Meanwhile, the immediate pressure of daily combat operations left little time for the methodical preparation that new tactics demanded. Japanese pilots found themselves attempting to implement theoretical concepts during life-or-death encounters with opponents who had mastered systematic application of technological superiority through extensive training and operational experience. The engagement above Leyte Gulf represented more than tactical defeat. It symbolized the fundamental transformation of aerial warfare from individual combat skill towards systematic application of industrial capacity. The 40 Zeros that had climbed toward American bomber formations represented the largest concentration of Japanese fighters that could be assembled for a single mission in late 1944. Their systematic destruction by a lone P-47 demonstrated that numerical concentration could no longer overcome technological disparity. Individual Japanese pilots continued demonstrating exceptional courage and tactical skill throughout the war's remaining months. But courage and skill proved inadequate against opponents who could deliver overwhelming firepower while remaining largely invulnerable to defensive capabilities that Japanese aircraft could bring to bear effectively. The tactical equation had shifted permanently in favor of systematic technological application over individual heroics. The broader strategic implications extended beyond individual combat encounters to encompass the entire trajectory of Japanese air power during the war's final phase. Units that had maintained offensive capability despite numerical disadvantages found themselves increasingly relegated to defensive reactions against opponents who controlled engagement terms through superior equipment and tactical flexibility. This strategic shift affected Japanese aviation culture in ways that transcended immediate tactical concerns. Pilots who had entered the war confident in their aircraft superiority and individual skills found themselves adapting to defensive mindsets that emphasized survival over victory. The psychological transformation undermined the aggressive spirit that had characterized Japanese aviation since the conflict's beginning, creating additional obstacles to effective tactical adaptation. The silence that descended over Japanese Naval Aviation Headquarters at Rabaul on October 8, 1944, carried the weight of strategic recognition that no amount of tactical innovation could overcome. Captain Minoru Genda, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's most respected aviation strategists, studied the preliminary reports filtering in from survivors of the Leyte Gulf engagement. 40 aircraft lost, 1 American fighter responsible. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. Genda had spent 3 years developing tactical doctrines that maximized Japanese advantages while minimizing enemy strengths. His innovations had enabled Japanese aviation to achieve air superiority across the Pacific, despite facing increasingly superior numbers and improving enemy capabilities. But the systematic destruction of an entire fighter group by a single P-47 represented a tactical reality that existing doctrine could no longer address effectively. The detailed debriefing of Flight Petty Officer Nishizawa provided insights that Japanese commanders desperately needed but could not effectively counter with available resources. His clinical description of American firepower effects revealed the fundamental obsolescence of aircraft designed according to entirely different combat parameters. The Zero's emphasis on maneuverability and range had become liabilities when facing opponents who could deliver overwhelming firepower while remaining largely invulnerable to Japanese defensive capabilities. American industrial capacity had reached production levels that enabled systematic replacement of tactical doctrine with technological superiority. Where Japanese pilots had learned to exploit individual skill and aircraft characteristics to overcome numerical disadvantages, American aviation had evolved towards systematic application of overwhelming firepower that minimized pilot risk while maximizing enemy casualties. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual combat encounters to encompass the entire trajectory of Japanese resistance during the war's final phase. Units that had maintained offensive operations despite resource constraints found themselves increasingly relegated to defensive reactions against opponents who controlled engagement terms through superior equipment and industrial capacity. Production statistics from Japanese aircraft factories confirmed the industrial disparity that made effective response increasingly difficult. Mitsubishi was producing approximately 60 Zero fighters monthly while struggling to maintain quality standards as experienced workers were conscripted for military service. Meanwhile, American factories were delivering hundreds of P-47's monthly while continuously improving performance characteristics and manufacturing quality. The maintenance requirements comparison proved even more sobering. Captured P-47 components demonstrated reliability standards that enabled extended combat operations with minimal service intervention. Japanese aircraft required frequent parts replacement and system adjustments that consumed logistics resources increasingly disrupted by American submarine warfare and strategic bombing campaigns. Material quality analysis revealed another dimension of industrial disparity affecting combat effectiveness. American aircraft incorporated advanced metallurgy and manufacturing techniques that Japanese industry had never developed adequately. The aluminum alloys used in P-47 construction provided superior strength-to-weight ratios, while the precision manufacturing enabled consistent performance across all production aircraft. Japanese aircraft production had been forced to accept material substitutions and manufacturing shortcuts that degraded performance and reliability. The lightweight construction that had originally provided tactical advantages now represented structural vulnerabilities when facing concentrated 50 caliber fire. Aircraft that had been designed for different combat parameters could not be adequately modified to address new tactical requirements. The training pipeline disparity compounded equipment disadvantages through systematic differences in pilot preparation and operational experience. American flight training programs had expanded to produce adequately skilled aviators in large numbers, while Japanese programs had been forced to reduce training duration due to fuel shortages and instructor casualties. The result was increasingly inexperienced Japanese pilots facing veteran American aviators flying superior aircraft. Fuel allocation provided another stark illustration of resource disparities affecting operational capability. American carriers operated with abundant aviation fuel that enabled extensive training flights and multiple daily combat missions. Japanese bases struggled with fuel shortages that limited practice flights, essential for maintaining pilot proficiency and developing new tactical procedures. The psychological impact on Japanese aviation culture proved as significant as material disadvantages in degrading operational effectiveness. Pilots who had entered the war confident in their technological superiority and individual skills found themselves adapting to defensive mindsets that emphasized survival over offensive action. The traditional Japanese emphasis on aggressive tactics and individual heroics became increasingly counterproductive against opponents who could systematically exploit technological advantages. Combat reports from surviving pilots described the demoralizing effect of watching entire formations disintegrate under concentrated American firepower while being unable to inflict equivalent damage in return. The traditional concept of honorable death in combat lost meaning when tactical situations offered no realistic possibility of achieving military objectives before being destroyed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.